Behind the polished marble columns and gilded symposium halls of ancient Athens, the true theater of power was not the agora but the bedroom. Here, aristocrats did not simply sleep, they performed. Among flickering oil lamps and perfumed silks, the boundaries between pleasure, politics, and pedagogy dissolved. A husband might slip from his wife's chamber to recline with a boy at the gymnasium, or summon a courtesan schooled not only in sex, but in rhetoric and war. Desire was currency-structured, strategic, and never merely private. These weren't secret passions, but rehearsed rituals embedded in the very architecture of the home and the laws of the city. In this world, eroticism was not a deviation from order, it was a way to maintain it. The male body was both weapon and temple. The female form both property and mirror of lineage. In this world, eros did not liberate. It bound. What truly unfolded behind those high courtyard walls was not a secret, it was a system. A system where every moan, glance, or union carried the weight of status, shame, and supremacy. The bedroom became a crucible of civic identity, where the body was not a sanctuary of the soul, but the stage upon which dominance was declared. Step through the stone threshold of an Athenian aristocrat's house, and you do not simply enter a dwelling, you enter a diagram of power. Every wall, every corridor, every threshold silently enforces a code older than any decree, separating bodies, intentions, and access. The structure is bifurcated by gender and rank, its very stones testifying to a brutal clarity. Men move freely. Women vanish behind veils of architecture. The andron, the men's chamber, lies nearest the street, bold, adorned, and public-facing. It is the site of the symposium, of wine, wit, and sanctioned indulgence. It is where elite men laugh, recline, perform dominance under the soft light of oil lamps. Meanwhile, buried deep in the womb of the house lies the gynaeceum, a sealed enclave where women cook, weave, raise children, and age in silence. This is no sanctuary. It is a fortress of invisibility. Daughters are hidden until bartered into marriage. Wives are protected, yes, but protected like a vault protects its contents, from theft, but also from light. There are no corridors of equality here, only a lattice of access and exclusion. Even slaves navigate the space differently. Male attendants may fetch wine for their masters in the andron, but female slaves are relegated to back rooms unless summoned for use. The spatial separation is not merely practical, it is profoundly ideological. The home, for all its geometric elegance, becomes a prison of roles, dictating who may be seen, touched, desired, or discarded. In these houses, physical placement mirrors social rank, and to step into the wrong room is to commit an act of rebellion. There are doors that do not open, sounds that must not be heard. Even the light is gendered, bright and smoky in the andron, soft and filtered in the gynaeceum. The result is a home where intimacy is scripted, where eroticism is not spontaneous but zoned like farmland, and where architecture becomes law. This division seeps into every gesture: a wife who walks too near the men's quarters, a husband who lingers too long in the family hall, a son who peeks into the women's space. All become moral threats, not logistical ones. In this arrangement, the house is less a residence than a machine of separation, a civic institution in miniature. Through these walls, children learn hierarchy before speech, learn shame before logic. The stones whisper, "Know your place." Desire may be fluid in rhetoric and art, but in the Greek household, it is walled, locked, and placed under surveillance. Thus, the very spaces that claim to house love are designed to control it. To understand the erotic landscape of ancient Greek aristocracy, one must confront a paradox as sharp as it is deliberate. The wife was sacred, yet silent. The hetaira, profane, yet adored. The Athenian wife, draped in modest veils and confined within the hushed quarters of the gynaeceum, was not chosen for her wit, nor for her companionship, but for her womb. Marriage among the elite was a transactiona, binding of houses, a fortification of legacy. The wife was a vessel, expected to bear sons and vanish behind the linen curtains of virtue, her presence more political than personal. She was the keeper of oikos, the guardian of domestic order, her erotic self erased in favor of maternal purpose. Yet, while the wife embroidered loyalty into tapestries and birthed heirs in silence, the hetaira stepped boldly into the flickering lamplight of male spaces. She reclined in the andron, poured wine into craters, and laughed not with obligation, but with power. The hetaira was no mere prostitute, she was cultivated, literate, and charismatic. She discussed Homer and Pericles, challenged thinkers at the symposium, and disarmed generals not only with her body, but with her mind. In an irony that bordered on the grotesque, aristocratic men entrusted their deepest pleasures, secrets, and vulnerabilities not to their wives, but to these public women who were not bound by lineage, but by wit. A man might boast of his wife's virtue in the daylight courts, but it was the hetaira who knew the curve of his back in the twilight hours. Even Socrates, that philosopher of restraint, is said to have conversed at length with Diotima, a woman whose teachings on love shaped the very spine of Plato's dialogues. The wife, meanwhile, remained absent from such recordsolent, compliant, and purposefully erased. And so the erotic economy divided. The wife guaranteed stability, the hetaira offered meaning. One ensured a name lived on, the other reminded the man he was still alive. But this division was not a secret. It was codified in law, immortalized in art, and whispered in every corridor of the elite home. The aristocrat's heart, it seems, was not split but meticulously organized. What the hetaira represented was not simply freedom, it was a calculated channeling of eros away from the volatility of marriage and toward a manageable, performative intimacy. In this world, desire was safer outside the household. Thus, the wife watched from behind her walls, as her husband found joy in the arms of women who could never bear his name, but often carried his soul. The result was a society that claimed to venerate chastity, while publicly celebrating the eloquence and sexual agency of women deemed unfit to marry. And the line between sacred and scandalous, like the veil over a bride's face, remained gossamer thin, easily parted, never forgotten. The room is low-lit and heavy with incense, the air thick with the scent of spiced wine and crushed myrrh, where oil lamps cast shadows across painted walls, and the faint echo of a lyre ripples beneath laughter. Welcome to the andron, the masculine heart of the Greek aristocratic home, and the stage of the symposium. This is not a feast, this is a ritual. Reclining on clinonero couches arranged in a U-shape, the elite men of Athens do not merely dine, they perform. Each gesture, each sip from a kylix, each joke or jab is part of an unspoken contest. Wine is diluted in the crater, not to curb intoxication but to prolong the play, for the symposium is a marathon of wit, seduction, and social maneuvering. As the evening swells, flute girls arrive, their melodies seductive and sharp, cutting through the murmurs like a siren's call. Hetairae glide between the guests, trailing laughter, perfume, and practiced charm. They are not passive, they listen, they spar. A well-placed remark, a teasing counter-argument, a sudden touch of the hand, these are the weapons of erotic diplomacy. Here, conversation can be more arousing than nudity, and laughter more dangerous than lust. The symposium sanctions what the daylight disavows: intoxication, flirtation, intimacy between men and women or men and boys. In this space, hierarchy is both challenged and affirmed. A young aristocrat may dazzle with a poem or be humiliated by an elder's story. A man may earn silent envy by securing the attention of a sought-after hetaira. Status is not static in this chamber, it is always in play. The body is not hidden in shame, but revealed in competition. Nudity, far from taboo, is aestheticized. Desire, far from private, becomes theater. Sometimes, the erotic is subtly gaze held too long, a hand brushed over silk. Other times it is grotesquely explicit public coupling, initiated not in secrecy, but as an offering to Dionysus, god of wine and ecstasy. For Dionysus blesses not restraint, but abandon, and in his name the boundaries between man and god, citizen and slave, eros and logos dissolve like wine into water. Yet even here, in this arena of sanctioned chaos, control remains. The wine must be mixed just so. The flute girls may play, but never speak out of turn. The hetaira may mock a man, but only to elevate his image. This is not freedom, it is choreography, a dance of dominance, orchestrated through appetite and allure. And as the night deepens and the crater is drained again, the true nature of the symposium reveals itself. It is not merely a gathering, but a calibrationa ritualized affirmation of who holds power, who yields, and who watches from the shadows. In the andron, wine flows like status, pleasure masks control, and every erotic encounter leaves behind not just sweat or scent but a record of rank, burned into memory like oil into linen. To understand the full scope of aristocratic eros in ancient Greece, one must turn unflinchingly to a practice both central and unsettling: pederasty, the eroticized mentorship between an adult male citizen, the Erastus, and an adolescent boy, the Eromenos. Far from being marginal or hidden, this institution was celebrated, normalized, and woven into the very fabric of elite male identity. It was not simply tolerated, it was lauded as a civic virtue, a form of pedagogy where the body became both subject and instrument. The Erastes was expected to court the boy with restraint, offering not just gifts such as oil flasks, lyres, or fine cloaks, but also wisdom, guidance, and discipline. The Eromenos, in turn, was to respond with modesty, resistance, and eventually selective yielding. This was not meant to be a mere seduction. It was framed as initiation, a delicate passage through which a boy would be shaped into a future citizen by submitting, symbolically and sometimes physically, to the authority of a seasoned man. The rhetoric surrounding this practice was grandiose. Philosophers claimed that love between males was purer, less carnal, more aspirational. Plato's dialogues sing of it as the path to the divine, where physical attraction becomes the spark for intellectual and moral transcendence. In this schema, the Erastes is not a predator but a sculptor, chiseling character from the unformed clay of youth. Yet the reality was more complex, more human, and often more harrowing. The boy's age was rarely fixed, his consent presumed, his feelings largely irrelevant. The institutions that framed the relationship as noble gymnasia, palaestras, symposia were also the spaces where the boy's vulnerability was exposed. Nude exercises, public grooming, and the constant surveillance of older men turned education into erotic theater. Laws forbade citizens from prostituting themselves, but only after a certain age. Before that, erotic attention could masquerade as mentorship. And while the practice was structured to end once the boy reached manhood, the scars of this temporary intimacy often lingered, unspoken. The erotic verses of Theognis and the visual art of red figure pottery do not shy away from this ritual. They depict bearded men gazing longingly at blooming youths, fingers extended, eyes fixed not on the soul but the thighs. And yet, this dynamic was lauded by orators, immortalized by poets, and accepted in polite society as a form of patriotic duty. The rationale was that through this union, a lineage of virtue would be transmitted, that the passion of the older man would awaken discipline in the younger, that the shame of weakness would be burned away by the fire of admiration. But beneath the idealism lay a darker truth. This was a system where power disguised itself as affection, where control wore the mask of love, and where the boy's body became a site of projection for the ambitions, anxieties, and unspoken hungers of the elite. In the education of desire, it was always the older man who wrote the lesson plan, and the boy who was told to feel honored simply for being chosen. In the world of ancient Greek aristocracy, desire was never immediate, was choreographed, staged, and sharpened by ritualized resistance, and nowhere was this more apparent than in the pursuit between Erastes and Eromenos. The older man did not seize, he wooed, he circled. He made his intentions visible through coded gifts and gestures, offering finely crafted oil flasks, intricately knotted hairbands, or exquisitely bred rooster symbols, not of affection, but of status, each item a public signal of erotic and social investment. The boy, adorned in the bloom of youth, was expected to resist, to retreat behind a cultivated modesty, to blush but not bolt, to allow the game to unfold. It was a paradoxical theaterone where yielding too quickly marked the boy as base, a future outcast in civic life, but resisting too long rendered the Erastes humiliated, his public identity diminished. In this careful ritual, the boy's body was the battleground on which the older man's worth was tested. Erotic access was not the endpoint of affectionate, was proof of dominance. To win the boy was to win symbolic mastery over beauty, virtue, and self-restraint. and to lose him was to suffer a public erosion of credibility. This pursuit was visible. It happened in the gymnasia, where both trained nude, glistening in olive oil, in the palaestra, where games became coded courtship, and even in the symposium, where a lingering glance or veiled praise might spark knowing laughter. The Erastes would offer mentorship lessons in poetry, war, politics, but always with an undercurrent of seduction, always pointing toward a climactic moment of moral and physical convergence. The boy's role, too, was active. He had to manage his boundaries, delay the inevitable, and above all, choose wisely. For in a society where being pursued was honor, but being seen as passive was ruin, the youth walked a razor's edge. The goal was not love, it was placement. The entire arrangement affirmed hierarchy: age over youth, citizen over future citizen, mind over body. Even if intimacy occurred, it had to maintain a form where the boy remained untouched in spirit, a willing pupil who absorbed power without appearing corrupted. And when consummation did occur, it was ideally brief, controlled, and contained within specific forms, never violating the ultimate fiction of noble mentorship. In essence, the pursuit was less about flesh than about legacy. The Erastes sought not merely a partner, but a vessel through which his virtues would echo beyond the grave. The boy, in turn, was being inducted into a lineage, not of romance, but of structured dominance. And behind every touch, every stolen moment in the baths, or whispered lesson beneath fig trees, lay a hard truth. This was not courtship, but a transaction of roles. One gained prestige through conquest, the other through becoming desirable enough to be chaste but never too available to be caught without dignity. This, then, was not a love story, it was a ritual of shaping men into masters and boys into futures. In the flickering lamplight of an Athenian banquet room, 7 men recline not only on couches but at the edge of metaphysical revelation. This is Plato's Symposium, the literary blueprint of philosophical eroticism, where desire is stripped of flesh only to be clothed in virtue, where lust is not banished but reinterpreted as a ladder toward the divine. Here, the body becomes not an end but a beginning, a spark that ignites a higher fire. The dialogue, fictional but rooted in the intellectual atmosphere of aristocratic Athens, unfolds like a sacred rite. Each man delivers a paean to Eros, the god of love, but their tributes are not to carnal chaos. Instead, they attempt to tame passion, to harness it, to elevate it from appetite into aspiration. Phaedrus speaks of love as the force that births courage in the warrior's heart. Pausanias draws a line between vulgar and noble eros. Aristophanes spins a myth where human beings once had 4 arms and legs, split in half by the gods, forever longing to reunite with their missing piece. But it is Socrates channeling Diotima who redefines desire entirely. He speaks of the ladder of love, a mystical ascent that begins with physical attraction to a single beautiful body, then expands to all beautiful bodies, then to the beauty of minds, laws, knowledge, and finally, if one is worthy, to the form of beauty itself, perfect, eternal, untouched. In this schema, sexual longing is no longer a distraction from wisdom. It is its first syllable. For the aristocrats schooled in such thought, lust becomes discipline, and discipline becomes politics. To be drawn to beauty is human, but to rise through it toward truth is divine. Thus, the Erastes is reimagined not as a predator, but as a philosopher-initiator, guiding the youth not into bed but toward metaphysical maturity. The Eromenos, in turn, becomes more than an object of pleasure. He becomes a mirror for the older man's virtue, a soul in bloom rather than a body in heat. And yet, this rhetoric is elegant and stringious, not without irony. For all its spiritual vocabulary, it is still rooted in hierarchy, still encoded in power. The erotic is not eliminated. It is spiritualized, refined, placed under intellectual quarantine. Flesh remains always present, always dangerous, but now it must justify itself through dialectic. The symposium becomes a theater not of passion, but of sublimation. Love is permitted, even praised, so long as it points upward. Pleasure is not denied, but deferred. In this world, the man who masters his longing is the one who deserves to lead. Sexual restraint becomes a form of civic virtue, a badge of nobility sharper than any seal. And as Athens teeters on the cusp of philosophical immortality, and imperial decline, this ideal of erotic transcendence becomes its parting myth, a final attempt to bind the body to the soul, and in doing so, to prove that power need not corrupt if it can be persuaded to ascend. To understand the erotic life of ancient Greek aristocrats, one must move beyond the dimly lit symposia and the perfumed aphorisms of philosophy into the cold geometry of law, where desire was not extinguished but categorized here, criminalized there, depending not on the act itself but on the status of the body involved. Athenian law, carved in the name of order and virtue, permitted a man to sleep with slaves, hetaira, and prostitutes without moral or civic repercussion. These women and, in many cases, boys were not citizens. They had no political voice, no legal standing, and therefore no ability to be violated in the eyes of the state. Their bodies were commodities, their suffering irrelevant, their consent assumed or altogether dismissed. But the citizen wife cloistered, veiled, and kept far from public eyes was another matter entirely. To touch her without the bonds of lawful marriage was not merely immoral, it was treasonous. Adultery was a crime not of passion but of property violation, a contamination of bloodlines, a disruption of inheritance. A man who seduced another's wife could legally be killed on the spot by the aggrieved husband, no trial necessary, but that same man could visit a brothel nightly and suffer no more than a raised eyebrow. The contradictions are glaring, but they were not considered contradictions at all, they were architecture. The oikos, the household, was the smallest political unit of the state, and like any state, it required boundaries, hierarchies, and laws. In this logic, the wife's body was not her own, it was the vessel of the citizen line, the guardian of purity, the physical archive of civic continuity. To adulterate her was to pollute the future. To use a slave, however, was to exercise one's masculine right. The double standard is not a flaw of the system, it is the system. Women's virtue was enforced by physical confinement and legal terror. A wife discovered to have been unfaithful faced not only divorce but social annihilation, loss of dowry, and disgrace for her entire kin. Meanwhile, a man who raped a slave or took a concubine was considered within his rights. His only failing might be extravagance, never immorality. Even accusations of male lovers, while sometimes scandalous, rarely had the weight of law unless they crossed into the realm of political shame. Thus, the legal code reveals the anatomy of aristocratic eros, a structure built not to regulate desire, but to channel it in ways that upheld patriarchal control and civic lineage. The state did not suppress male appetite, it sculpted it, directed it, and ensured that every release reaffirmed domination. The Athenian man was expected to be both ruler and consumer, and the law ensured him against disorder by criminalizing any eros that threatened his household sanctity, while permitting every other indulgence that reinforced his power. The bedroom, the courtroom, and the council were not separate realms, they were mirrors of each other, and in each, the body was never just flesh, it was policy. At the summit of Acrocorinth, where the mountain plunges like a knife into the sky, stood the famed temple of Aphrodite, veiled in rose smoke and rumor, and said to be served not by priests, but by courtesans thousands, if ancient writers are to be believed, who offered their bodies not for coin but for piety, enacting what later historians would call sacred prostitution. Whether this tale is literal truth or embroidered fantasy, its power lies in what it reveals about how ancient Greece entwined eros and divinity. Unlike the austere gods of later faiths, the Greek pantheon was unapologetically carnal. Aphrodite did not merely sanction love, she was its embodiment, its flame, its sanction, and its punishment. To lay with a woman in her service was not sin but sacrament, yet the records are muddy. Herodotus and Strabo wrote of these temple courtesans, women who, either by vow or coercion, gave their flesh to strangers in exchange for the goddess's favor. But modern scholars debate these accounts, noting their origins in second-hand tales, Orientalist exaggerations, and moralistic storytelling. Perhaps these stories were less documentation and more projection-anxious reflections of what happens when women possess both sexuality and sanctity. For in the Greek mind, the female body was not simply a vessel of reproduction or temptation, it was a threshold, a liminal space where civic order met divine chaos. The idea of sacred prostitution, whether real or mythologized, exposed a cultural truth that sex was never merely private, never merely profane. It was public, performative, and potentially holy. In a polis obsessed with boundaries between citizen and slave, wife and hetaira, order and anarchist notion of a woman offering sex as ritual exploded those lines. The sacred prostitute, if she existed, stood at a dangerous intersection. A woman with agency, with divine justification, untethered from husband or father, and yet central to the religious identity of the city. Her touch was not shameful, it was cleansing. Her moans, echoes of cosmic order. Such a figure was both venerated and feared. She embodied the Greek tension between control and abandon, between Apollo's symmetry and Dionysus's delirium. For the men who entered the temple, offering silver and sweat, it was not lust, it was participation in a greater drama, where the erotic became echo of the celestial, where climax mirrored the divine convergence of chaos into form. Whether or not these rites truly happened matters less than the fact that they were believed, feared, envied. They haunted the imagination, painting the temple as a theater of divine appetite and feminine power. And in a culture where civic identity was etched into the skin, the myth of sacred prostitution served a purpose. It reminded the elite that even their most structured, strategized eros could not escape the shadow of the gods. In the end, the story of Aphrodite's temple is not about history. It is about belief and the terrifying possibility that the body, when offered freely to the divine, might hold more authority than the laws of men. In the soil of Attica and the ash heaps of burned estates, archaeologists have unearthed what Athenian speech was often too restrainedor, too strategic to utter aloud. The glazed confessions of a civilization painted in black and red, scenes of thighs parted, lips grazing, satyrs grinning, and youths bending in silent invitation. These vases, elegant in form and grotesque in content, were not hidden curiosities. They were displayed, exchanged, and admired in the very spaces where power and eros converged. A kylix passed at a symposium might depict precisely what was unfolding before the eyes. A boy pursued by a bearded man, a hetaira crouched between two revelers, or a group of satyrs in Dionysian frenzy. Their erections comic in size but deadly in implication. These images were not accidental, they were instructional. They taught, they affirmed, and they warned. In a world where spoken language was layered with euphemism and silence, these painted scenes were brutally clear, stripping desire of metaphor and freezing it in ceramic permanence. They taught the youth what to expect: the positioning of limbs, the roles assigned by age, the performance expected of both lover and beloved. They reminded the man of his right to pursue, to feast, to command. But not all the images are celebratory. Many carry a subtle cruelty. Boys shown with eyes turned away, satyrs mounting nymphs who recoil, orgies edged with violence and asymmetry. These were not idealizations, they were mirrors, and sometimes warnings. To misplay your role in this erotic economy was not only a personal error, it was a civic blemish. For the vase was both invitation and indictment. One might read in the careful curvature of a wrist the difference between noble courtship and disgraceful indulgence. A glance too submissive, a gesture too hungry, and the viewer understood the lesson. Beauty must resist, power must guide. Even the grotesque bodies of satyr shaft-man, half-beast, eternally erect stood as emblems of what unregulated eros looked like: animalistic, comic, dangerous. The elite Athenian viewed these not with horror, but with wary amusement. The satyr was what he might become if he lost control, if he allowed desire to outpace decorum. Thus, the vase was a visual philosophy more immediate than Plato, more permanent than rumor. It whispered through paint, "This is what you may do. This is what you must never be seen to want too much." Some scenes celebrated conquest, others hinted at humiliation. Together, they formed a visual code of elite sexuality, precise, public, and enduring. And because these vases were gifted, displayed at symposia, and even placed in graves, they became part of the afterlife of erotic memoria, legacy not only of beauty, but of control. In the silent curve of terracotta, where lips met hips and hands grasped thighs, Athens laid bare its truths, truths too volatile for law, too intimate for prose. They endure not because they were beautiful, but because they were honest. The vase spoke when the tongue could not, and what it said still burns through time. Beneath the marble villas and behind the perfumed folds of symposium curtains, an invisible chorus of bodies moved without voice, without name, without protection, the slaves of the Athenian elite, whose flesh was not their own and whose consent was never required. They were the infrastructure of desire, the mute architecture upon which aristocratic pleasure was built. Boys oiled and trained to walk with elegance, their skin rubbed with imported myrrh. Girls taken from Thrace, Lydia, or Egypt, stripped of lineage and molded into instruments of submission. Eunuchs altered by force, their masculinity erased to become more palatable, more pliant, more decorous for the tastes of men who wished to dominate without challenge. These bodies did not appear in Plato's dialogues or in the painted amphorae passed from hand to hand. They existed in the margins, crucial, constant, and erased. The perfumed boy who handed a kylix was also the one summoned after the guests departed. The quiet girl who played the aulos was the same whose presence was expected in the bedchamber without acknowledgement, without pause. Slaves were used not only for labor but for intimacy, often from childhood, and their silence was part of the arrangement. To resist was unthinkable, and to speak was unnecessary. The law recognized no violation if the violated belonged to no citizen family. Their pain did not register as damage, only as disobedience. They could be whipped for denying a caress, sold for aging, discarded for defiance, and yet they were essentia lubricating the machinery of elite eros not only with their bodies but with their invisibility. Their suffering was not incidental. It was systemic. It was the background hum against which the moans of the privileged found rhythm. A man might lecture on moderation by day and command the silence of a sobbing slave by night. The contradiction was not hidden, it was institutional. In the world of aristocratic sexuality, beauty was currency, and slaves were banks of it. They were dressed, trained, arranged like furniture, and their touch was considered more refined than the clumsy affection of wives or the unpredictable emotions of lovers. They did not speak unless spoken to. They did not bleed unless permitted. And when they cried, it was behind closed doors, if at all. No poems were written for them, no statues carved. Yet they were the heartbeat of a culture that demanded pleasure without interruption, obedience without cost. Their silence made the system function too eloquent. A protest would collapse the fragile myth of noble eros, of elevated desire. But though the records are mute, the truth remains. For every Athenian man who ascended the ladder of love, there was a body beneath his feet, unnamed, uncelebrated, and unsaved. These slaves were not shadows, they were structure. And though history tried to forget them, their absence is louder than any hymn to beauty, any ode to philosophy. In the scent they wore, in the bruises they concealed, in the lips they kept closed, they told the most brutal truth of all, that in the world of ancient eroticism, pleasure was power, and power demanded silence. In the final flickers of lamplight and the clink of emptied craters, the Athenian symposium, so often celebrated as a crucible of wit, seduction, and high culture, sometimes revealed its true, rotting core. A stage not for flirtation, but for degradation, not for refined eros, but for ritualized abuse masquerading as elite entitlement. Behind the soft music, the lyrical verses, and the knowing laughter lay darker righteous aristocrats who, shielded by status and emboldened by law, enacted desires not simply unrestrained but grotesquely choreographed. In these private chambers, the line between invitation and coercion dissolved, and pleasure, if it could be called that, became indistinguishable from humiliation. It was not uncommon for symposia to culminate in games of power, where slaves were ordered to perform before the guests, stripped of dignity and name, their bodies exposed like animals at auction. Some were beaten not in anger, but in ritual punished to display a master's control, to stoke the eroticism of dominance. Hetaira, too, though educated and paid, could find themselves cornered into scenes they did not choose, their refinement twisted into mockery as laughter turned cruel. Even youths, the once idealized eromenoi, could become objects of spectacle, their initial resistance rebranded as coyness, their reluctance overridden by social expectation and the unspoken contract of elite grooming. The symposium, that supposed temple of self-restraint, often collapsed under its own hypocrisy. revealing a culture where control was the ultimate aphrodisiac, breaking a body, the final proof of superiority. Some records speak, obliquely, of men using legal loopholes to torment those beneath them, lashing a servant for spilling wine, then demanding his submission as compensation, branding a female slave who attempted to flee the night's festivities, declaring a boy's tears ritual cleansing after a forced coupling. These were not anomalies. They were known, seen, and in the silent consensus of the illiterated. For in a society where the body was a site of training, where hierarchy was eroticized, and where vulnerability equaled usefulness, the capacity to inflict pain became indistinguishable from the right to pursue pleasure. And yet, what was labeled as affection, as intimacy, as education, bore all the marks of systemic abuse codified through cultural performance. The participants might have laughed, reclined, quoted poetry as it happened, but the laughter was brittle, the poetry a veil, the consent illusory. No law was broken, no shame attached. For shame requires acknowledgement of equality, and, in these rooms, there was none. What remained was theater, bodies displayed like conquered cities, submission demanded like tribute, climax delivered, not in mutual rapture but in the quiet sob of someone too low to be heard. In this, Greek eros reveals its darkest edge, not simply as appetite, but as ritual, as spectacle, as the repeated reaffirmation of who may touch and who must never refuse. Beneath the philosophies, beneath the laws, beneath the pottery and the hymns, lies a simple, brutal structure, pleasure as proof of power, and the body as its silent witness. And in that silence, the screams never truly stopped. They were simply folded into the rhythm of the evening, like music. As Athens staggered into the twilight of its glory, ravaged by war, political strife, and the slow corrosion of civic unity, its erotic ideal sense draped in the silk of philosophy, and the armor of ritual began to unravel into parody, indulgence, and grotesque mimicry of their former sanctity. The disciplined eros that Plato had exalted into a ladder of divine ascent now slouched into decadence, its rungs slick with irony and excess. The hetaira, once a figure of cultivated brilliance and erotic mystery, was increasingly rendered as spectacle, her wit replaced by vulgarity, her intellect reduced to performance. No longer the partner in elegant dialogue, she became a character in men's drunken games, a prop rather than a participant. The Eromenos, too, faded from his pedestal. The youthful lover, once sculpted in poetry and bronze as the blossom of civic virtue, transformed into little more than a hired body, his beauty commercialized, his role transactional, his eyes dulled by repetition. In the crumbling villas of a fractured city, the symposia became more frequent and more desperate, not rituals of refinement, but bacchanals of escape. The wine was stronger, the games crueler, the laughter hollow. Pleasure once tied to ideals of mentorship, virtue, and public duty had lost its anchor. It no longer pointed upward. It spiraled inward, festering in the bored and bloated bodies of men who had once commanded armies and composed laws. The elite body itself, once a symbol of measured control and aesthetic balance, now sagged under the weight of indulgence. Bellies swelled, appetites grew erratic, and the once disciplined pursuit of beauty gave way to the frantic consumption of novelty. The philosophers had warned of this. Plato feared the tyranny of the appetites, and Aristotle spoke of balance, but their teachings became ornaments in the mouths of the very men who defied them. Athens, which had once eroticized restraint as the highest form of power, now glorified gluttony. The private chamber became not a stage of symbolic intimacy but a den of compulsive excess. Even the art changed. The red figure vases, so precise and layered with coded meaning, gave way to cruder forms, more literal, less evocative. Satyrs, once metaphors of warning, now mirrored their viewers too closely. In this world of decay, the boundaries between lover and client, between symposiast and addict, between eros and entropy, dissolved entirely. What was left was not desire, but compulsion. Not beauty, but bloat. And as the flesh of the polis rotted, its laws corrupted, its democracy hollowed, its citizens fractured, so too did its most intimate rituals. Eroticism, which had once structured identity and reinforced civic order, now revealed the emptiness at the city's core. What had been philosophy became farce. What had been ceremony became spectacle. The elite body, once a model for the city, now testified to its fall not with a scream, but with a sigh, glazed in oil, slumped in silk, bloated with power, and numb to consequence. Athens had once taught the world to desire wisely. Now it simply consumed. The architecture of desire built in the bedrooms of ancient Greece did not collapse with the Parthenon, nor did it vanish into dust like the frescoes of forgotten symposiate migrated, mutated, and survives. Its outlines still visible in the foundations of modern thought, law, art, and power. From the andron's calculated pursuit of the beautiful boy to the hetaira's seductive intellect, the Greek erotic ideology seeped into the Roman Empire, where emperors adopted not only the philosophy but the performance of Greek intimacy. Nero paraded his male lover Sporus through the streets in a bridal veil. Hadrian wept publicly for his drowned Eromenos, Antinios, then deified him, erecting statues across the empire. These gestures were not deviations, they were inheritances, filtered through Roman spectacle and imperial whim. Centuries later, as the Renaissance unfurled its velvet banners of rediscovery, artists and thinkers returned to the Greek ideal of the beautiful male form and the sensual intellectual bond. Michelangelo sculpted bodies not merely in marble but in longing. Leonardo wrote of geometry and love with the same trembling pen. The symposium was not forgotten, it was taught. And with it came the lingering shadow of the Erastes and Eromenos, not always in name but in the shape of the older male mentor and the pliant, admiring youth. Even modern education bears its trace: the philosopher and the protege, the teacher whose affection blurs into obsession, the institution that protects power even when it molests trust. We still speak of pedagogy with reverence, unaware of its roots in a system where learning was fused with seduction, where authority came with the right to touch. In contemporary scandals, priests, professors, producers, the ancient echo is deafening. We still struggle to separate mentorship from manipulation, guidance from grooming. The Greek dichotomy of wife and hetaira also survives, reshaped but familiar. The woman who is good enough to marry must remain untouched. The woman who speaks freely, who enjoys her body, is still too often made a spectacle. Our laws, too, remain lopsided: men forgiven for appetites, women punished for availability. And in language, the legacy whispers. We use platonic to mean love without sex, though Plato's lovers were drenched in both. We describe symposiums as intellectual gatherings, forgetting they began with drunken debates and ritual intimacy. We lionize restraint in public men while permitting them appetites in private, just as Athens once did. What was once carved on vases is now streamed in silence. What was once spoken in the andron is now hidden in encrypted texts. But the shape of the system, the elevation of power through eros, the justification of control through desire, remains intact. The Greek bedroom, with its veils, its training, its hierarchies, still casts its long shadow over the bedrooms of today. And though the walls have changed, the roles often have not. The past does not die in ruins. It sleeps beneath our rituals, our scandals, our loves waiting to be touched again. In the end, the Athenian bedroom, draped in linen, lit by trembling oil, sweet with crushed herbs and skin, was never private, never safe, never simply a chamber of rest or passion. It was a theater of citizenship, a crucible of hierarchy, a stage upon which roles were not only played but burned into the flesh of those who entered. In ancient Greece, desire was not some ungoverned instinct. Wild and unwelcome it was doctrine, discipline, and design. Love did not liberate, it sculpted. The Erastes did not merely pursue a youth, he prepared him for power by enacting it upon his body. The hetaira did not merely entertain, she translated seduction into spectacle, intellect into currency. The wife was not merely hidden, she was quarantined, her silence proof of lineage and law. Sex in this world was not the shadow of politics, it was its rehearsal. The rhythms of the symposium echoed in the courts. The hierarchies of the home mirrored those of the state. The Athenian citizen learned dominance through desire, practiced submission through flirtation, and understood control not just through law but through flesh. Even philosophy, that supposed ascent of the soul, was smuggled through the touch of an older hand on a younger thigh. And yet, No one in this erotic system, neither the powerful nor the powerless, was truly free. The man who loved was expected to pursue strategically, restrain performatively, and dominate without seeming brutal. The youth who was loved was expected to resist symbolically, yield gracefully, and endure silently. The courtesan was required to be both object and oracle, intelligent but never threatening, sexual but never sovereign. Even the slave, whose body was the most honest reflection of the system's violence, was told that their silence was service, their pain a function. What emerged was not a culture of pleasure, but a civilization of choreography, where every kiss was a cue, every gesture an affirmation of structure. And so, as Athens rose and fell, as its walls were breached and its monuments crumbled, the ideology it etched into the bedchamber endured. Not because it was natural, but because it was useful, because it trained generations to conflate longing with order, domination with duty, and intimacy with surveillance. What remains today are the fragments, poems of yearning, vases of pursuit, laws of contradiction, and myths of transcendence. But behind each fragment lies a question, urgent and unresolved. When a society scripts desire to serve power, who is left untouched? In ancient Greece, even the gods loved with violence, and mortals followed their lead. The bedroom, like the agora, was a place of spectaclinode of truth, and in its shadows we see our own the lingering ghost of love, reduced to lesson, of flesh reduced to function, of freedom suspended on the edge of a smile. What Athens taught the world was not how to love, but how to organize it. And what it left behind was not just art or thought, but a system, waiting, still, in the quiet places where longing meets law.